Have you ever noticed that some of the greatest atrocities in history were not committed by evil people, but by ordinary people who simply stopped thinking? There is an invisible force that transforms intelligent individuals into blind masses, and it is operating right now, around you, perhaps even inside you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian who faced the Nazi regime and paid with his own life for his courage, discovered something disturbing while observing his intelligent and educated compatriots surrender to fascism. He realized it wasn't evil that dominated people, but something far more dangerous, collective stupidity. And what's most frightening is that this force doesn't choose victims based on intelligence or education. It can capture any one of us. Bonhoeffer wrote his reflections in letters from prison, knowing he would probably be executed. He observed how his neighbors, teachers, doctors and engineers, brilliant people in their fields, suddenly became incapable of reasoning when confronted with Nazi propaganda. It wasn't ignorance, it was something deeper and more sinister. It was as if an essential part of their humanity had been switched off. And what he discovered was this: stupidity, in the sense he used it, is not a lack of intelligence. It is the voluntary renunciation of critical thinking. It's when you stop questioning, stop doubting, stop thinking for yourself. Imagine a person who, in their professional life, solves complex problems, analyzes data, makes thoughtful decisions. But when they enter certain social contexts, when confronted with group narratives, when pressured by the majority, this same person becomes incapable of applying the same critical reasoning. They didn't become less intelligent. They simply allowed their capacity to think to be hijacked by something bigger than themselves. Bonhoeffer noticed that when people gather in masses, especially under the influence of powerful ideologies or charismatic leaders, something happens to their individual psyche. It's as if personal responsibility for thinking is dissolved into the collective. The person no longer needs to think for themselves because the group thinks for them. The person no longer needs to question because the group already has all the answers. And most dangerous, the person no longer needs to carry the moral weight of their actions because now they are just a drop in the ocean, just another voice in the chorus. During the Nazi regime, Bonhoeffer tried to talk with people he had known for years, people he respected, people who had been his friends, and he discovered something desperate. No matter how logical his arguments were, no matter how much evidence he presented, these people simply couldn't process what he was saying. Not because they were stupid in the traditional sense, but because they had surrendered their capacity to think independently. They had become extensions of the ideology, no longer thinking individuals. He wrote something that should keep us awake at night. Against stupidity we are defenseless. Protest or force accomplish nothing against it. Arguments have no effect. Facts that contradict personal prejudices simply don't need to be believed, and when they are irrefutable, they can simply be dismissed as unimportant exceptions. Think about that for a moment. He's saying that when someone falls into this state of collective stupidity, you cannot reach them with reason. It's as if they're behind an invisible glass, hearing you but incapable of really processing what you're saying. But here's the question that must be burning in your mind now. How does this happen? How do intelligent, educated, well-intentioned people fall into this trap? Bonhoeffer's answer is both simple and profound. It happens when we allow external forces to do our thinking for us. It happens when we trade the difficult freedom of thinking for the comfortable certainty of belonging. You see, thinking for yourself is exhausting. It's lonely. It's risky. When you think for yourself, you may reach conclusions that isolate you from the group. You may discover truths that nobody wants to hear. You may have to take positions that make you unpopular, that put you in danger, that require you to pay a high price. But when you allow the group to think for you, everything becomes easier. You always know what to say. You always know what to think. You always have the approval of those around you. The problem is that you stop being you. You become just a reflection, an echo, a puppet dancing as others pull the strings. And here's what makes this truly terrifying. This doesn't just happen in totalitarian regimes. It happens in democracies. It happens in corporations. It happens in families. It happens in social movements that claim to be progressive and liberating. It happens whenever a group develops a narrative so strong, an identity so cohesive, that questioning that narrative means betraying the group. And nobody wants to be a traitor. Nobody wants to be left out. So slowly, imperceptibly, we surrender our critical thinking on the altar of belonging. If this idea has already resonated with you, imagine what comes next. Subscribe so you don't miss this journey, because what we're going to explore now will challenge everything you think about your own capacity to think freely. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you agreed with something not because you really believed it, but because everyone around you believed it? How many times have you stayed silent when your conscience screamed for you to speak, simply because speaking would mean going against consensus? How many times have you repeated opinions you never really examined, ideas you never really questioned, beliefs you never really tested? I'm not judging you. I'm including myself in this. We all do this. It's part of being human. We are social animals. Our brain is programmed to seek group approval because for most of our evolutionary history, being expelled from the group meant death. So we developed deep psychological mechanisms to conform, to fit in, to be accepted. The problem is that these same mechanisms that kept us alive on the African savannas now make us vulnerable to manipulation, to propaganda, to tyranny disguised as consensus. Bonhoeffer realized that collective stupidity is not a moral defect, but a human condition that emerges under certain circumstances. Specifically, it emerges when there is a power that monopolizes the narrative, that controls the discourse, that punishes deviation and rewards conformity. This power can be a government, a corporation, an ideology, a religion, a social movement, even a social media algorithm that reinforces your existing beliefs and isolates you from different perspectives. And here's the most frightening aspect. The victims of collective stupidity don't know they are victims. They sincerely believe they are thinking for themselves. They have elaborate arguments for their positions. They can quote experts, studies, data. But all these arguments, experts and data were carefully selected to confirm what the group has already decided to be true. Any evidence that contradicts the group's narrative is automatically dismissed, ridiculed, attacked. Have you ever tried to discuss a controversial topic with someone who is deeply invested in an ideological position? No matter how carefully you present your arguments, no matter how gentle your approach, you probably noticed you're not really having a conversation. You're talking to a defense system, not to a person open to reason. And what's most frustrating is that this person probably feels exactly the same way about you. This brings us to a frightening question. How do we know that we are not the victims of collective stupidity? How can we be sure that our deepest beliefs are not just echoes from an echo chamber? How do we distinguish genuine thinking from disguised conformity? Bonhoeffer had an answer to this, and it won't make you feel comfortable. He said that only through inner liberation is it possible to overcome stupidity. But what does inner liberation mean? It means having the courage to examine your own beliefs with the same critical rigor you apply to others' beliefs. It means being willing to be wrong, even about things you've defended for years. It means valuing truth more than belonging, even when that choice cost you friendships, opportunities, security. But there is an even deeper secret that few know. Something Bonhoeffer discovered in his final weeks of life, something that may be the key to escaping this trap. He realized that collective stupidity is not overcome by better arguments or more convincing facts. It is overcome by something completely different, by the recovery of inner dignity. You see, when a person surrenders their thinking to the group, they are not just renouncing reason, they are renouncing their own essential humanity, their dignity as a thinking and free being. Bonhoeffer discovered that the only people who resisted Nazism were not necessarily the most intelligent or the most informed. They were those who had a deep sense of personal dignity, an inner core that refused to be bent, a conviction that there are things more important than social approval or even physical survival. They were people who preferred to die being themselves than to live as copies, as puppets, as extensions of an ideology. And this brings us to the most disturbing revelation of all. Collective stupidity can only prosper where there is inner cowardice. Not physical cowardice, but moral cowardice. The refusal to look at yourself honestly, the refusal to question your own certainties, the refusal to admit that you may be wrong, that you may have been deceived, that you may have contributed to something destructive while believing you were doing good. Think about the great horrors of history, the Inquisition, slavery, genocides, totalitarianisms. All of them were perpetrated not by monsters, but by ordinary people who sincerely believed they were on the right side. People who had elaborate justifications for their actions. People who saw themselves as heroes, not as villains. And the only thing all these people had in common was the refusal to critically examine their own beliefs and their groups' narratives. So what do we do with this? How do we escape this trap? Bonhoeffer, in his last letters before being executed, offered a path. He said that liberation does not come from outside, but from within. It doesn't come from convincing others, but from freeing yourself. And this liberation begins with a simple but devastating question. What do I believe, not because I carefully examined it, but because everyone around me believes it? Which opinions do I defend, not because they are true, but because defending them keeps me safe, accepted, included? These questions are dangerous because once you start asking them honestly, you can no longer live in the comfortable illusion that you are always right, that your group is always right, that your beliefs are obviously true to any rational person. You have to confront the frightening possibility that maybe, just maybe, you have been part of the problem you criticize in others. The law of collective stupidity operates because we are all vulnerable to it, not just others, not just the ignorant, not just those on the opposite side of the political spectrum, all of us. And the only defense is constant vigilance over our own thought processes, the humility to admit we may be wrong, the courage to question even when questioning isolates us. Bonhoeffer was hanged by the Nazis a few days before the concentration camp where he was imprisoned was liberated. He died because he refused to stop thinking, because he refused to surrender his inner dignity, because he chose truth over survival. And his last words to the camp doctor were, "This is the end, but for me it is the beginning of life." He had discovered that there is something more important than physical life, inner life, the freedom to think, the dignity of remaining human even when the world around you goes mad. So here is my final question for you. Are you really thinking for yourself, or are you just repeating what your group decided you should think? Do you have the courage to question your own certainties? Are you willing to pay the price of inner freedom, which may include loneliness, rejection, misunderstanding? Because collective stupidity can only be defeated one person at a time, starting with you, starting now, starting with the brutal honesty of looking inward and asking, who am I really when nobody is watching, when there is no group to please, when only my conscience and I remain? This is not just abstract philosophy, it is the most practical and urgent question of our lives. Because we live in an era of extreme polarization, of algorithmic echo chambers, of political and ideological tribalisms, where the pressure to conform is more subtle, but perhaps more powerful than ever. And the only thing that can save us is not better arguments or better policies, but the collective recovery of individual courage to think. If this message touched something in you, if it awakened questions you need to explore, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But more importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not because you want to convert them to your worldview, but because you want to invite them to the same journey of honesty and inner freedom that you are beginning. Because resistance to collective stupidity is not organized in masses. It begins silently, one consciousness at a time, until enough free people exist to remind the world what it means to be truly human.